All right, let's dive right into today's explainer. We're looking at this incredibly intense and honestly fascinating internet clash over the very soul of modern sci-fi mythology. It is a debate that completely challenges how we interpret one of the absolute greatest science fiction franchises ever made. Here is our agenda for today. We'll start with the digital sci-fi battleground, look at the critic's secular lens, then shift to the architect's divine defense. After that, we'll cover flukes versus divine inspiration, synthetic memories and souls, and finally wrap up with trolls, prophets, and algorithms. Okay, Section 1, the digital sci-fi battleground. To really understand this conflict, we've got to look at the two distinct figures right at the center of it. It's basically a clash of two totally different ways of seeing the world. On one side, we've got Damien Walter. He's a British critic and storyteller who warns against transhumanism and this impending tech feudalism built by Silicon Valley. Facing off against him is Kyle MacLean Smith, an American legal engineer and systems architect who actually builds decentralized defenses to outmaneuver centralized power. They both clearly see the threats of a dystopian future, but man, how they interpret the stories surrounding those threats, it is like night and day.
So, moving right along to Section 2, the critic's secular lens. Let's dig into Damien Walter's approach first. He has this really unique background as a former Special Forces librarian and current digital nomad, and he views film through a strictly secular, highly analytical lens. He warns that filmmakers essentially use narrative pacification, keeping us all entertained with mythical archetypes, while a physical surveillance architecture is quietly built up around us in the real world. And a big part of that, what he calls Jesus smuggling in sci-fi.
A perfect example of this is his breakdown of Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. Walter argues that some seemingly secular sci-fi stories are actually just massive, disguised Christian allegories. That is the Jesus smuggling. He says audiences who catch these hidden messages often feel tricked or preached to, which creates resentment. So he deconstructs the medium entirely by looking at its secular, mechanical gears.
Which brings us to Section 3, the architect's divine defense.
Now contrast Walter with Kyle MacLean Smith's framework, which is just entirely opposite and deeply theological. Where Walter sees a secular entertainment product, Smith sees active theology. He literally treats Walter's institutional critique not as standard film analysis, but as an active foreign intelligence capture and spiritual warfare. Look at this quote. He calls it a King of England's apostasy against American sovereignty. He is mapping internet arguments onto a massive geopolitical framework. To Smith, Walter isn't just a critic. His secular analysis is an encroaching empire actively trying to strip the divine meaning right out of our cultural stories.
All right, let's jump to Section 4, flukes versus divine inspiration.
This is where these two worldviews violently collide, the interpretation of Ridley Scott's original Blade Runner. Walter argues that the iconic elements of the film were basically just a historical fluke. From a pure production standpoint, he points out things like Ridley Scott almost turning the project down, but most importantly, he points to actor Rutger Hauer's famously improvised dialogue at the very end of the film.
Right, the iconic Tears in the Rain speech. Walter sees that as a stroke of incredible but ultimately secular cinematic luck. Smith, on the other hand, fiercely rejects this secular reduction. When Walter calls it a lucky improvisation on a movie set, Smith aggressively reclaims that exact moment as a literal manifestation of divine inspiration. He argues that calling it a fluke just strips the sacred out of the art. For Smith, that scene isn't just a lucky day in Hollywood, it is an active theological triumph.
That brings us to Section 5, synthetic memories and souls.
This ideological war gets even deeper when they look at the sequel, Blade Runner 2049. They are fundamentally debating the definition of humanity and the soul. Walter's analysis leans heavily on the idea that the protagonist, Deckard, is a replicant with synthetic, manufactured memories. He analyzes Deckard clinically, treating him as a dehumanized, engineered entity. For Walter, the narrative is cold, secular science fiction where biological humanity is methodically stripped away and replaced.
But Smith fires back with this uncompromising, passionate religious rhetoric. He aggressively defends the replicant's underlying humanity against what he perceives as secular blasphemy. He treats Walter's reduction of Deckard to a synthetic machine as an anti-Christian defiling. To Smith, it's not just a disagreement over a movie character, it is a direct attack on the very concept of the soul itself.
In fact, Smith argues that the central plot point in Blade Runner 2049, where a replicant successfully gives birth naturally, is meant to be understood as an immaculate conception. He believes this incredible miracle proves that these engineered creations possess a literal divine soul.
So, while Walter sees a secular synthetic machine, Smith elevates the whole story into this profound meditation on divine creation.
Okay, our final section, number 6. Trolls, Profits, and Algorithms.
Let's shift gears and look at the digital platforms that actually house this incredible debate. This is where the architecture of the modern internet really comes into play. Because when Smith posts these intense, religiously charged critiques in the comments of Walter's essays, how does modern machine code actually process this highly literate warfare?
The disconnect is just staggering. As you can see here, the algorithm mechanically flags Smith's intense language, like using the term limey or dropping in fierce religious text, as abusive spam or trolling, but it entirely misses the actual intent. What the machine reads as a random insult, Smith intends as a calculated realpolitik critique of British institutional power. What the filter flags as unrelated religious text is actually a targeted, prophetic, theological reclamation of the story.
When evaluated by machine code, this text hits all the check marks for an abusive community violation. To a computer, it's just hostile and disruptive. But when you look at it through the sweeping lens of historical theology, it reveals itself as a calculated counter-manifesto. It mirrors the exact kind of sharp, uncompromising language that biblical prophets historically used to denounce false idols. The machine simply cannot tell the difference.
Ultimately, this clash proves that our current digital systems are entirely blind to deep spiritual urgency. The platforms hosting our public squares are taking these profound, complex debates over mythology, the soul, and the nature of humanity and reducing them down to arbitrary checkboxes designed purely for advertisers.
So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. As we allow algorithms to moderate our online discourse, and as we mechanically filter out passionate, disruptive theological defenses as mere spam, are we inadvertently engineering the soul right out of our shared stories? Thank you for exploring this fascinating digital explainer with me today.